Hello, many of you have probably heard that Azerbaijan recently launched a new offensive on Armenia. And in this video, I want to explain how this entire conflict started. And it is a very morally gray conflict and a very complex conflict. And I just want to lay out the facts for you, and then you can decide which side is right. So, like many other conflicts, this entire story starts with the First World War. Before the First World War, all the ethnicities and nationalities that were later recognized by the Soviets lived in a very peaceful and stable state. They were all oppressed under the Russian Empire, and they all didn't even have the right to call themselves a separate nationality, to see themselves as something other than the Russians. That right was first given to them by the Soviets. And the Soviet Union, by the way, is the first country that implemented the principle of ethno-federalism. And Putin's Russia actually still holds this principle. To this day, Putin's Russia is still an ethno-federalist country. And in the chaos of the First World War, the Bolshevik revolution happens, and Lenin actually proclaims that all the nations have the right of self-determination. And the Soviets also recognize 186 different nations that exist under the Soviet Union. But something weird happens in the Caucasus, between the borders of Armenia and Azerbaijan, the borders of the Soviet Socialist Republics of Azerbaijan and Armenia. If you see Nagorno-Karabakh here on this map, so it is a region with an Armenian majority, and this region was given to Azerbaijan, and this is the only example of a nationality that had their own republic but was still given to another republic, was still given as an autonomous region to another Soviet Socialist republic. Nagorno-Karabakh is the only example of this happening in the Soviet Union. And so one might ask, why was this done? A legitimate question, especially given the fact that the Armenians were the majority in Nagorno-Karabakh. Well, the answer is the Soviets in year of our Lord, 1921, wanted to have a good relationship with Turkey. They were economically isolated and they didn't have many economic partners. And in fact, their only partners, economic partners at the time, were Turkey and the Weimar Republic, since all three countries hated the Versailles World Order. And Turkey insisted that they will be economic partners with the Soviets and that they will sign the Treaty of Brotherhood or the Treaty of Moscow only if Nagorno-Karabakh is given to the Socialist Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan, because Turkey was afraid that others as Muslims would be discriminated under Armenia, and so they didn't want the Azer minority in Nagorno-Karabakh to be discriminated, and they insisted that they will only sign a treaty if the region is given to Azerbaijan. And so Stalin accepted their terms, although at first this entire region was merged into a trans-Caucasian Soviet Federal Socialist Republic of Transcaucasia until 1936, but within that republic the borders were already set. And for a while, actually, life was, relatively speaking, good for minorities in the Soviet Union. Of course, collectivization happened and many of them died, but from the perspective of language rights and cultural rights, they had more freedom than at any other time in the history of the Russian Empire. Lenin insisted on the fact that minorities should be given the right to have their own language and their own culture, and Stalin for a while followed Lenin's policy, and life was, relatively speaking, good. Minorities were given the rights to, for example, have movies shown in cinemas on their own language. They were also given a right to use their own languages in the Soviet administration. They were given the right, for example, to use their own languages in the military, in museums, in theaters. But in 1934, Stalin actually decides that Russian nationalism could be used as a cohesive force to merge the Soviet Union together, and he actually revises Leninism in an important way. He says, unlike Lenin, Lenin claimed that smaller nationalisms could be recognized as something good. But Stalin then said, well, Russian nationalism could also be useful. And Stalin decides to use the Russian language as the lingua franca of the Soviet Union. He becomes convinced that the Russian culture should be used in order to merge all these different culture and religions together, and that's why the Russian language becomes an official language of Soviet administration in 1934. And the language rights and minority rights are once again suppressed, and the spirit of Russian nationalism emerges, and although one could still say it wasn't as bad as in the Russian Empire, but still Stalin often did dog whistle to Russian nationalists, and this short period of somewhere around 10 years of freedom and cultural development for minorities such as, well, also Ukrainians, but also the nations in Central Asia, well, this period of freedom for them ends, at least for a while. And what is also interesting is that the Azerbaijani nationalism actually develops for the first time in the Soviet Union. Before that, they were just a collection of tribes fighting each other. But Armenian nationalism, on the other hand, was of a longer origin. It existed even before the Soviet Union, and in fact the first great public protests that happened in the Soviet Union happened in 1965 in Armenia. They are demanding a couple of things. They want the Armenian genocide to be recognized, and they also want the Soviet Union to do something about the economic discrimination that's happening in Nagorno-Karabakh. And they do have a point, because the Socialist Republic of Azerbaijan is not investing enough money into Nagorno-Karabakh, and they actually have a plan to keep Nagorno-Karabakh as a rural area and extract resources from it in order to develop industry in other parts of Azerbaijan. And the protests do happen, but they are not fully successful. But at this point, the Soviets respond by building this huge temple complex to the Armenian genocide, to the victims of the Armenian genocide, and they also recognize the genocide, and they also recognize that economic discrimination is happening in Nagorno-Karabakh. But they don't do much about it. They just recognize that the problem exists, but at the time that is also enough in order to pacify the conflict. But as Gorbachev in the late 1980s starts to liberalize the Soviet Union, and he introduces glasnost and perestroika, old ethnic and national animosities come to life once again. And already in 1988, the Armenian paramilitaries start attacking Azerbaijani villages in their own regions. And at this point, the Armenians are the angrier ones, since they are the ones being oppressed. They also argue that it was a mistake to give Nagorno-Karabakh to the Azerbaijan in the first place, that Stalin only did it because Turkey coerced him to do so, and so they start to attack Armenian villages. And in year of our Lord 1990, this conflict becomes so serious that the Soviet Union intervenes with helicopters and tanks, and they start to shoot at the Armenian paramilitaries. And that's why many historians call this the only and first civil war of the Soviet Union, because already in 1990 there were entire villages getting burned, there were Soviet helicopters shooting rockets in the hills of Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh. And yeah, it was a civil war. But on the other hand, hatred on the one side creates hatred on another side. And in Azerbaijan, Armenians are getting ethnically cleansed. In Baku, in late 1980s, there is an ethnic cleansing of Armenians. 20,000 Armenians are ethnically cleansed from Baku, and Gorbachev orders a Soviet intervention, and the Soviet military actually kills 150 Azerbaijanis in order to protect the Armenians. But at the same time, or a bit later, they began to kill Armenian ultra-nationalist paramilitaries that are ethnically cleansing the Azerbaijani people. So the Soviets at this point truly are just trying to keep peace and protect both sides from each other, one could say. But we all know what happened, as there is a military coup against Gorbachev, various republics proclaim independence, Yeltsin proclaims Russian independence, and he is seen as a hero. And by the way, the only time in history when the Russian people wanted independence from the Soviet Union was in 1991, and that is precisely the time when they got what they wanted. And yeah, the statues of Lenin are falling all across the Soviet Union, but in some regions that leads to violence and chaos. The Soviet military, as they are retreating, they leave thousands and thousands of guns and tanks and Kalashnikovs behind them. Some generals decide to stay and rule as warlords and just sell guns to both sides, both to Armenians and to Azerbaijanis. Others just flee, leaving weapons behind, and that is why in Armenia and Azerbaijan in 1991 you could actually buy a Kalashnikov for one bottle of vodka. You could replace a bottle of vodka for a Kalashnikov. That's how many guns there were in the Caucasus, in the southern Caucasus in 1991. And by the way, this was the bloodiest war in the Caucasus after the Chechen War. So altogether, somewhere around 25,000 people died in the first Nagorno-Karabakh War. And there was also a civil war in Tajikistan, a conflict that I know absolutely nothing about, but it also happened. So the fall of the Soviet Union, it wasn't really so peaceful as some claim it to be. But okay, let us return to our original topic, Armenia versus Azerbaijan. And so the war starts, and at first it seemed that Azerbaijanis have the advantage, since they had more guns, since more Soviet military were stationed in Azerbaijan than in Armenia. But Armenians have two crucial advantages. For a very longer time, they were actually the ones training and planning for conflict, and they have a lot more paramilitaries on their territory and on the Nagorno-Karabakh territory, since they were the angrier ones. They were the ones dreaming about war and about making the injustice that was done by Stalin right, in their opinion, of course. And they also have another advantage, and that is Armenians are statistically much more likely to be officers in the Soviet military than Azerbaijanis. Probably because of this history of brotherhood that existed between Armenians and Russians. They are both Orthodox Christians. And many of the Armenian officers decide to stay and fight on this side of Armenia. And that military expertise and experience that they have in the early stage of the war actually helps them significantly. And here you can see chaos happening in Russia as this war is becoming worse and worse. Yeltsin here is ordering the tanks to attack his own parliament. But yeah, the war in the Southern Caucasus is getting worse and worse. And yeah, what also needs to be said is that the Armenians, for a long time, they are actually winning the conflict. But in 1992, the Azerbaijani leadership is changed, and the Gornaboy offensive happens, and the Azeris are actually able to start a huge offensive, and they actually managed to get Russian military officers on their side. And it seems in the summer of 1992 that suddenly Azerbaijan is winning, and they reclaim 40% of Nagorno-Karabakh, because in the first stage of war the entirety of Nagorno-Karabakh was taken by Armenia, and now Azerbaijan gets 40% of it back. But their offensive is stopped in the hills of Susha. So why is it stopped? Well, not only because it's hard to advance through the hills if they are defended, but something weird happens. The Armenians actually send their Russian officers to fight against the Azerbaijanis, and that was a very cunning thing to do, because they realized that all tank drivers and helicopter drivers in the Azerbaijani military are Russians, and the Russians have a hard time killing their own people, and that's why the Russian offensive actually stops at the hills of Susha. The Azerbaijani offensive stops, and the Russians are willing to go no further. They don't want to kill other Russians. And something important also happens in 1992. In the late 1992, Yeltsin's Russia had this bizarre policy of arming both sides until late 1992, but suddenly after the Susha offensive fails, they decide to help only Armenia, and the Armenians are able to launch a successful counteroffensive and crush the Azerbaijani offensive. And here we can see a tank that entered the city of Susha, and this was the first Armenian tank that entered the city, and although it was damaged by Azerbaijani forces, it still exists, and it is still used as a monument of national pride for the Armenians. And there is this saying in Armenia that the war was won with Russian guns and American money, because many rich Armenians in the United States also send money, and that also happened quite significantly. And as I already said, Russian guns were also a crucial element. And in the first Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, Armenia was victorious, and they also managed to conquer 13% of Azerbaijani territory that was internationally recognized as the territory of Azerbaijan. And here you can see a street of the freedom fighters in Nagorno-Karabakh. But as you know, in year of our Lord 2020, Azerbaijan decided it is time to return the borders to what they were in the Soviet Union. And their argument is simply, well, it was an unjust war. We don't care if you have the majority in Nagorno-Karabakh. We should just go back to what the borders were in the Soviet Union. And Azerbaijan attacked. And this is how the borders looked in the 1990s. But as I already said, Azerbaijan launched an offensive, and the offensive was actually pretty successful, and they reclaimed most of Nagorno-Karabakh, but something happened that stopped them from achieving all of their goals, and that is Putin's Russia intervened. And although I do agree that Putin's Russia is one of the biggest bad guys of the 21st century, at least in Europe it is, with all the stuff that Putin is doing in Ukraine and in Georgia. But in this particular conflict, Putin's Russia actually did save lives by intervening and forcing Azerbaijan to stop their war of conquest. Now, you could argue that it is actually a justified war, but the Armenian argument is simply, well, even if the war in the 1990s was unjust, we don't want another war. We don't want children getting shelled and killed by Azerbaijani tanks. And Putin's intervention in this particular conflict, at least, did actually save lives. And Putin is here continuing what he sees as the historical mission of the Russian Empire to protect the Christians from the Muslims, or at least Orthodox Christians from the Muslims in this region of the world. And as you can see on this map, this corridor is now currently held by the Russian military, and it still allows Armenians to have contact with parts of Nagorno-Karabakh that are still under their control. And yeah, I wanted to share with you the story of how the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict started, and I leave you, the audience, to decide who is right, and does Azerbaijan actually have a right to reclaim the territory that was won by Armenia in the first Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, or is peace more important than what the let's say, what the principles, what the UN actually sees as a internationally recognized territory. And Armenia also has solid arguments. They simply claim that the territory was never supposed to be given to Azerbaijan, since that was an exemption, and the Soviets never gave such autonomous regions to other republics other than the Socialist Soviet Republic of Armenia, of Azerbaijan. So yeah, that's all for this video, and see you in the next one.